Welcome to the Big World Made Small podcast for the adventure traveler. I'm thrilled you're here. My name is Jason Elkins, and in addition to being your host, I'm also a former U.S. Army paratrooper, third-generation commercial hot air balloon pilot, paramotor pilot, ex-Montana fly fishing guide, advanced open water scuba diver, and a full-time nomad that's visited more than 30 countries on 6 continents. As a seasoned adventure travel expert with a passion for creating and sharing meaningful experiences, I'm on a quest to impact the lives of adventure travelers, tour operators they rely on, and the communities that host them. Every week, I bring you exclusive interviews with fascinating adventure tourism experts who have agreed to share their personal stories, favorite destinations, and some invaluable travel insights they've picked up along the way. We'll enjoy a casual conversation, create some connections, and likely share some laughs. It's my hope that by the end of each episode, this big world will feel just a bit smaller. Let's get started, shall we? Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Big World Made Small podcast for the adventure traveler. Today, I'm really thrilled. I've got a fellow podcaster, someone that's been doing it a lot longer than I have, joining the show. And also, he's kind of an extreme world traveler. We've got Gary Arndt. He's a podcaster, as I mentioned. He's got the Everything Everywhere Daily podcast. Gary, welcome to the show. Happy to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This is exciting. You and I spoke a week or so ago, and you kind of told me about some of the stuff you'd been involved in. And I think we could do a whole series of podcasts just having conversations with you. But I really want to dig into kind of that part that connects with, adventure travel, however we define that. Maybe I'll even ask you to define that. And before we really kind of get into the details, I want to go back a little bit. I want to kind of figure out, how did you get, what inspired you to go from wherever you were to where you are now? So how far back do we need to go to kind of understand you, Gary?
Probably back to my childhood.
Yep.
My dad used to subscribe to National Geographic, and I was always a voracious reader, and I would always read stories about different places around the world. My family was not very well traveled. I never saw salt water till I was 21 years old.
Oh, wow.
Just for an example, which is
where did you grow up?
Actually not uncommon when you live in the middle of the country. But
yeah, I was going to ask that. Where did you grow up?
Wisconsin.
Okay.
So we had water, but just not salt water. And in fact, I can tell you the first time I ever saw salt water, it was in Puget Sound. It was my senior year in college. We were going to the national debate tournament, and we were passing this one park, I think just in Seattle, and we were in a van. I was like, stop the van, stop the van. And they're like, what? And I ran out and I tasted the water to verify that there was, in fact, salt in it.
That's cool.
It was.
Right.
So
yeah, I get that. So younger, I heard the National Geographics. I as well. My parents, actually, when I was born, they bought they bought the whole year worth of episodes and kept them. And as a kid, I was reading them as well. I'm curious if you were kind of like I was, where I had the maps. I was really into the maps. I would take the maps out that they'd put in the center, and I had maps hung up all over my room. I don't know. Were you into maps as well?
You will notice.
Oh my gosh.
One of the largest collections of National Geographic magazine in the world is sitting in my office.
I see that. Yeah, that's quite impressive. All right.
Yeah, I mean, you can't see it, but up here I have framed maps of pre-World War I Europe. That was in an early issue. I have a photo taken from National Geographic. It was the first photo ever to show the curvature of the Earth. It was taken from a stratospheric balloon flight in, I think, 1932 that National Geographic sponsored. So, yeah, I have a massive collection of maps, all sorts of stuff.
I'm going to show my ignorance here. What's National Geographic doing these days? I haven't seen one in a while.
They're suffering. They exist. They expanded, in the 90s into, they were always, the National Geographic was a nonprofit organization, and the magazine was the magazine for their membership, kind of like AARP has a magazine and things like that. And then they created a for-profit division, and they expanded into a, cable network, all sorts of stuff. And they invested into a lot of things which really aren't doing very well today. Basic cable is not doing great. Magazines are not doing great. They closed National Geographic Traveler. They had an adventure magazine that they closed. National Geographic, the main magazine, still exists, but they're not getting the revenue that they used to. I know people who work there, and I've just heard of litany of kind of bad things over the years. I mean, they still exist, and I think they'll always kind of exist in some form. And maybe the solution is they go back to their original roots of being an organization rather than a commercial enterprise.
Yeah,
but I think the commercial part of it was bought by Disney.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and that's going to tie into our conversation a bit, because at some point we're going to be kind of discussing, the changes. You've been through changes through your career in this industry, and now we're having a conversation on a video call from, I don't know, where are you right now?
Wisconsin.
Okay, you're in Wisconsin now. I'm here in Columbia, and we're doing this video call. You're a podcaster, and photographer, blogger, and quite a few things that you've done. So you've seen a lot of those changes yourself. That maybe some of the similar things impacted National Geographic. And before we go there, I want to go back. Okay, so your childhood, National Geographic. You never saw the saltwater until you were 21. You mentioned that your parents weren't big travelers. But other than National Geographic, was there individuals in your life that inspired you to want to travel? You went to the saltwater at 21.
No,
things just took off.
I said, my family never traveled. Nobody in my family ever went anywhere. We drove through part of Ontario once when I was a kid going to Niagara Falls, and that was my international travel experience. So I no, there was nothing in my life that really kind of would have led people to believe that I would end up doing that.
Did you kind of think you might? I mean, because you were into the National Geographic stuff. Did you think when I get out of the house, I'm going to go do this stuff? Or what were you thinking?
No, what happened is in the 90s, I started a very early internet company. I sold that to a large multinational company in 1998. And then I conned them after the sale into sending me to all their offices around the world to talk about the internet. And so I went on a 3-week whirlwind tour to Tokyo, Taipei, Singapore, Frankfurt, Brussels, Paris, and London. Circumnavigated the globe. First time I had ever done that. I had to get a passport, never did that before. And that kind of got it started. So then the year after that, on my own, for the heck of it, I went to Iceland. It was actually a pretty easy place to get to. I went back to school to study geology and geophysics, managed to do a research trip to Argentina where we collected soil samples, and we ended up leaving the field early. We gathered everything as quickly as we could so we could go eat steak in Buenos Aires because it was really cheap. After that, I kind of came up with this idea that I didn't want to go into academia. I did not like that world. If you're an entrepreneur, I think you can understand, it's a lot of people in academia, they're there for the safety. Mm-hmm. You get tenure, you get put on this track, you just jump through these hoops. And it wasn't something that appealed to me. And I came up with this idea of selling my home to travel around the world. I was in my mid-30s. I had no kids, no wife. I had sold a business. There was no reason for me not to do it. So I told everyone that's what I was going to do. And at this point in my life, everyone was like, yeah, okay, whatever Gary says he's going to do. And then in March of 2007, I closed on my home before the real estate bubble burst, and set out to travel around the world. And basically the plan was go west. And it took me about, the rest of 2007 really to cross the Pacific Ocean. And I just went to all these different little island countries. And I had a website that I started at the time, which gained a following, I think, because I was doing something different. Now there's this digital nomad thing. A lot of people doing it. At the time, nobody was. And I was also doing an around the world trip in a way that most people, they just go to like major cities. Mm-hmm. They'll go to London, Paris, Sydney, Hong Kong, Bangkok, places like that. And I was going to Samoa, Tonga, Vanuatu, places that a lot of people, quite frankly, have never heard of. And I think that piqued a lot of interest in my site and what I was doing. I would write articles giving my thoughts about these places, some of their background and history. And the website eventually became one of the biggest travel blogs in the world. And not that was saying much at the time, because there weren't a lot of them. And that 1 year around the world ended up becoming over a decade. Wow. I just sort of never stopped.
What do you think the difference is between the person that does the round the world and hits the major cities compared to the person that really just takes their time and probably gets distracted many, many times along the way, which it sounds like, I don't know if distracted is the right word. You tell me.
I mean, a lot of times you only have a set amount of time. Maybe you'll devote 3 months to something like this. You have to get back for something. My schedule was very open-ended. I sold my house, so I didn't have to be anywhere. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people also, and this isn't just true of that, but it's whenever they travel, they go to some place that they know about. So I meet a lot of people, just in the community I live, they say they're going to Europe. I would say 80% of them are all going to Italy or Ireland. Mm-hmm. That's what they know. And if they're not, maybe it's like Germany or or England. And if I tell people, wow, Croatia has this great stuff, or Montenegro, that's too crazy. And this deal goes into the problem of over tourism. It's not that there are too many tourists. It's that there are too many tourists at the same place at the same time, because everybody knows about Venice. Everybody knows about Barcelona. And I've had many conversations with people that run tourism boards that we don't need to promote Barcelona. And the Spanish Tourism Board sponsors my podcast. And I've talked to them about this. It's like, Barcelona's good. We want people to get to the other parts of the country, and they just don't know of these places. But because they know of this, that's what they want to see. They have to see this. And, I've told people, it's like, oh, well, we're going to Bora Bora or Tahiti. I was like, oh, those are, fine places. But if you go to the Cook Islands, you can have the same experience at a fraction of the price. And it's like, no, we want to go to Tahiti.
I'm curious, what do you think the role of social media, the Instagram world, has done to that? Has it made it better, worse? Because I can see scenarios where worse. I want to go to Bora Bora because I want a picture of myself doing what people do in Bora Bora so I can put it on Instagram.
I want to see a picture of an overwater bungalow.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say.
Basically, and I say this as someone who has grown several large social media accounts. I have a little under 200,000 people that follow me on Instagram. I could tell you before I posted a photo how well the photo would do. Photos of mountains and of certain things perform well, and nothing else does. So I have a lot. Like I said, I was a very accomplished travel photographer. I won pretty much every travel photography award there is to win in North America in the 2010s. A lot of my photographer friends who likewise have large social media followings, they make their money now, not by selling photos, because there's really no market for that, but by selling trips. And all their trips are to places like Iceland, Patagonia, the Canadian Rockies, where it's the same shots over and over and over. Mm-hmm. They're not really doing much else. And so there are a couple places that get famous on social media, and then more people go there so they can basically post the same shot of them there, Troll's Tongue in Norway or whatever. And again, it's just, that's what people know. And so that's where they want to go.
And some people pride themselves in going places where other people don't. I don't know if pride is the right word, but I know, for example, for myself in my travels, I tend to, when I'm like, wow, this is really cool, and then I look around and there's no other tourists around, I feel like I'm really having a special experience. And I think there are some people like that. Obviously, those are probably a lot of the people that are following you in your social media and when you were blogging, because you were writing about these more off the beaten path types of places. What have you learned about human psychology that explains that?
There are just always going to be people that if everybody does X, they're going to want to do Y. And the thing is, most of the places that are popular, they're popular for a reason. It's not that they're bad places. Venice is great. Mm-hmm. The pyramids are great. If you're going to be in Egypt, you should go see the pyramids because there's a reason. They're pretty cool. But the thing is, you can go to Venice in December or March even, right, where there aren't crowds. I did, one of my last trips before the pandemic is I went to Ibiza and Mallorca in December, just before Christmas. Nobody was there. Like, it was empty. I could get a seat at a restaurant anywhere. It wasn't crowded. Hotel rooms were cheap. Yeah, it wasn't quite as warm as it is in the summer, but a lot warmer than where I live. That's for sure. And all the great historical sites that I visited and driving around the island and it's experiencing all these things rather than just sitting at a beach. That was all still there, all still wonderful, still sunny. But a lot of people just don't think to do that.
Yeah. No, that's it's interesting. I'm pretty fascinated by the psychology of people. I actually read recently, and maybe this you can relate to this, but I was reading about, I can't remember the name of the word that they use, but it's basically the diagnosis of wanderlust, almost travel addiction. And I don't know, maybe you've read about this stuff as well, but they're talking about actually the term like extreme world traveler type was what was coming up in these articles about people that just have this need or this desire to just experience things, specifically travel. And I understand that there's now a diagnosis in the diagnostic manual for psychiatric disorders. Do you know the word? Are you familiar with what I'm speaking of? I'm sure you can speak to it anyway.
Come across what you're talking about. I think there are different types of people. So I'm active in several groups of people that are like trying to visit every country in the world.
Yeah.
Some of those people,
that conversation came up in the articles.
Some of those people don't want to experience anything.
Yeah.
They are literally just going through a checklist. There was this one woman and she visited every country in the world. And then she made a big media thing about it. I'm the first woman to do it. She wasn't. Many other women were found, like dozens that had done it before her. And a lot of the places she literally got off the plane, got her passport stamped, went back on the plane.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't see the point in that. There's a couple places I've been to where I've been literally, a couple hundred meters from the border, and I could have crossed and I just never did because there was no reason to. Just getting your passport stamped doesn't do anything for me.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big things I did was always visit UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and some of them are very well known, like Venice or the pyramids or things like that. But then I would say the vast majority of them, nobody's ever heard of. And you really have to go out of your way to visit some of these. And I've made some very, lengthy trips to very obscure places to see things that when I showed up was like, oh, we don't really get any visitors here. Why are you here? And to go see and photograph some of these sites. So it's, when I say a lot of people, it's like, well, how many countries have you been to? And that's a discussion because it's like, well, how do you define a country? But what the real thing is like, yeah, I've been to Australia. I've been to every state in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
I've been to every Canadian province 3 times. I've been to every U.S. state twice. I've been to every state in Germany. I've been to, every country in the United Kingdom. So it's doing exploration within these places, not simply landing at the airport, checking a box off and claiming victory.
There's a, kind of a phrase or whatever, kind of like, is it about the destination or the journey? Some people really are focused on the destination. They want to get to the destination to the point that they kind of just walk with blinders on, don't look at anything else until they get to the destination. And then oftentimes they may be disappointed or whatever. You sound more like a kind of journey type of guy, but I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, it's the destination.
Yeah. Well,
because
I'm thinking
our journeys today are on an airplane and flying sucks. There's nothing noble or romantic about sitting in a seat for 12 hours.
Well, I'm with you on that part.
So this whole journey thing, maybe that was true in an era of steamships when it took a month to cross the Atlantic and you could meet people and talk to them or something. But that's not true on a plane.
But I'm curious. Well, hold on though, because you mentioned like these UNESCO World Heritage Sites that are quite a journey to get there. You're not flying right into that heritage site.
No, I'm usually renting a car or getting a train or something.
Right. Do you enjoy that part? Do you feel like you get, do you?
I would prefer to always drive than be on a train if that's a reasonable option that's available.
See, and what I hear in that, well, I don't know. Why is that? Tell me why that is.
Because you have control over where you're going.
You
can do a side trip if you want. You can stop. You can see something. A lot of people are, especially Americans, if you go to a place like Australia or the UK or Ireland where they drive on the other side of the road, they're terrified at the idea of doing that. Mm-hmm. And it's something that's really not hard to do. You just have to do it. Yeah. And the first time I ever drove on the other side of the road, I rented a camper van in downtown Auckland, and I had to leave Auckland. And so here I am in the middle of this major city, and I turned off the radio. I put both hands at 2 and 10 and just repeated to myself, stay on the left, stay on the left, stay on the left. And it's actually super easy to do once you get on a highway. Yeah. Because you're just going straight. But in a city, when you're turning and getting on roundabouts and I got to do this the other way. And it took me a few hours to get the hang of it. And I've driven so many miles now on the other side of the road that I consider myself kind of an ambidextrous driver.
Have you had those moments where you forget? Obviously, yes, sometimes, but I remember I had an experience. My father had spent quite a bit of time in Australia and he'd come back to visit and he picked us up at school and we got in the truck and he pulled out onto the left side of the road.
Yeah, I did that once.
Outside the school. I was like, okay, kind of muscle memory or whatever.
But that doesn't last very long. You realize pretty quick, oh yeah, because the steering wheel is on the other side of the car too. So the thing that's usually the same, and there are some countries where this is an exception, is that the driver's side is usually in the median of the road. Mm-hmm. But there are places like the Bahamas where they drive on the left, but they have American cars. Or places in the Pacific like Micronesia where most of their cars are Japanese cars, but they drive on the right. So they're doing it just the opposite.
And maybe if they're used to it, but I think of like, if you're in London or in England and you take the tunnel or whatever they call it to go over to mainland Europe, I can imagine that if you're doing that very often, that can get kind of confusing. But
the only border crossing I've done where they switched sides was going from Laos to Thailand. And I remember going over the border and they just had a sign that was like, remember to drive on the other side of the road.
Yeah. So, well, I guess I heard you say, I'd rather rent a car than take a train. And it's because I can kind of look around a little bit. I can stop. I have control over if I see something interesting, I can pull over, stop and go look at it, which is, I guess, where I was going with that. Is it about the journey or the destination type of thing? I was just trying to get a feel for, the reason you go on the journey is for the destination. Okay.
You're not going to get in a car and just drive around in circles to go nowhere. You want to have a destination in mind. So I do think it's ultimately about the destination. We talk about destinations, but there are choices you have to make in how you get there.
Yeah.
Like I said, if it was possible, and I wish somebody would do this, it used to be if you went from, say, the U.S. to Europe, you had to go by ship, right? Before World War II, and aviation became a big thing. Now that's really not an option. Cunard does have a cruise that they do, but they actually go far slower than they need to because they want to make a thing out of it. So it's like a 1-week trip from New York to Southampton, I think. But they could do it. I've asked people, like, they could do it in 4 days. If there was a company that did a low-cost cruise from New York to Southampton in 4 days, I would do that every time going to Europe.
Wow.
Because they now have internet on board. You have Starlink, and you could be productive. You would have an actual room. You could sleep on a bed rather than being uncomfortable in an economy class seat. Like, the worst cabin in a cruise ship is far. That's better than a first class, lay down bed in an airplane, because it's an actual bed with a shower, and you can adjust your time zone, an hour every day. Boom. There's no jet lag when you arrive. So I would do that. I think a lot of people would too. Maybe it wouldn't be the majority of people. Most people would want to save time. But if you have the time, I think it would be a great option. I keep waiting for someone to do it. I would totally, because there are repositioning cruises as well, but they only happen like twice a year.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would do that as well, because if you're able to do whatever you do normally, work, for example, if you can spend 4 days working and avoid that whole hassle of the flying, and you don't have anything else to do, then why not?
Yeah.
That makes sense. All right. So so let's go back. You started the website, hugely successful with your travel blogging, and where should we go from there?
I traveled around the world for, 10 years, pretty much nonstop. Eventually started to get burned out. I got a home base. Lived in Minneapolis for a couple of years, where I would be on the road about half to a third of the year. And then the pandemic hit. I remember my last international trip was in Portugal. I come home on February 28th, 2020, get COVID right away, probably picked it up at the airport.
Oh, you're one of those guys that brought it over.
Oh, I was probably one of many.
Yeah.
They kept doing tests where they found out that it was actually here like earlier and earlier than we thought, going back to like November or October of 2019. So I'm sick the first week of March, and this is early enough where, nothing's closing down yet, and there aren't enough tests available. And they're like, save it for first responders. And I'm like, whatever. I get better after a few days. I felt horrible. And then kind of in the middle of March 2020, everything starts shutting down. The entire tourism industry basically collapses in a 2-week period. And everything I had going on disappeared. All the contracts I had, traffic to the website, people just stopped being interested in travel, because the thing is, most people are only care about travel when they're about to go on a trip. It's not something you follow like sports or technology or politics or things like that, where something's always going on. And I had some problems with where travel media was going even before the pandemic, because a lot had changed since I first started my website. Social media became prominent, and they just sucked life out of everything. Instead of people going to your website, they now went to Facebook or Twitter, and then they put in an algorithm and they thwarted what people saw. So you had to either pay money or, play the game and do the clickbait type stuff. And by the time the pandemic hit, talking to other bloggers, they were all getting 90% of their traffic from Google searches. And what happened was, instead of talking about your travels or your thoughts of traveling around the world, it just all became 15 things to do in Las Vegas. Everyone was doing the same articles based on keyword research to get traffic, and you didn't even need to travel anymore, right? None of that actually mattered. And I kind of saw the writing on the wall. And sure enough, this year, 2024, Google changed their algorithm and most travel blogs got hammered. Like they lost, 80, 90% of their traffic because it was all based on one thing. And because I kind of figured that this was eventually going to happen, I decided to do a big pivot during the pandemic because I didn't feel I could rely on the travel industry anymore. And I launched a new podcast that wasn't a travel podcast per se. I call it travel adjacent. Mm-hmm. It's more of an educational show that allows me to talk about all the places I visited and the experiences I had, but it wasn't a travel show per se. Stay at this hotel, go to this place. It wasn't that. It was just telling the history of these places, mm-hmm. which people could be interested in every day without necessarily wanting to go on a trip. And that's pretty much what I've been doing ever since.
And you're doing one episode a day, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the daily. And I mean, you and I'd be fascinated to understand the work that goes into that, how you do that, how you batch that. And I don't want to bore the listeners. You don't batch
There's
it?
No batching at all. I have not written tomorrow's show.
Wow. Okay. I'm impressed.
I write a 2,000 word term paper every day.
Wow.
Literally the ability to write more than one a day is not. Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
This is just in time inventory.
All right.
There's no, what I do is I will run reruns. I have enough episodes now. Tomorrow's episode will be number 5,800 or 1,585
mm-hmm.
That I'll just do reruns, maybe 2 times a week.
Okay. And I was wondering how you take some time off and step away from that, because that would be, okay. All right. Well, that's pretty cool. And I've listened to a few of your episodes, and I love what you say. You said travel adjacent,
mm-hmm.
because I think, our audience is the same, right? It's the same type of person, not necessarily. I mean, I don't know. I'm curious what you think, but somebody that would have read your travel blog, 10 years ago, that type of person is still going to be interested in probably most of the episodes you do. Do you feel like it's shifted your audience?
No, I think it's by and large that. I mean, there's lots of things that are travel adjacent. Travel can be seen of as its own thing. But like I said, people are only interested in travel when they're going on a trip.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a whole host of things where you can look at it through the lens of travel.
Mm-hmm.
One of the best is food. Anthony Bourdain's show was not a travel show.
Right.
It was a food show, but he looked at it through the lens of travel.
Mm-hmm.
Every episode was something to do with food. It wasn't this hotel, the airport, whatever. It was a food show. I know people that visit sports stadiums. I know people that are trying to visit golf courses. That necessitates travel, but the focus is sports, really. And they're looking at it through the lens of travel. And what I'm doing is history and education. And a lot of that, not always, but a lot of the shows can be looked at through the lens of travel. And this is something that I've had a hard time getting people in the travel industry to figure out, that they just can't get their head around it. That, you have to write an article about our place and it has to be on a travel site or something. And I'm like, well, people are going to find it through search. Do a search on any topic you can think of about your destination. There are already 10 articles on page 1. Why do you need more?
And
right? What you want to do is reach
10
people.
best places to visit in.
And if you're doing a search, you already know about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're doing planning at that point, not discovery. The way you learn about things is serendipity, but you didn't even know you didn't know it, right? One of the reasons why filming locations from the Game of Thrones became tourist attractions, it's not because people were looking for travel destinations. They were like, oh, that's cool. I want to go see that.
Yeah. They never would have found that had it not been for watching an episode or 2 or 3 or the whole series. Okay.
But it's been very successful. And the weird thing is, when I was doing travel photography, running my blog, I used to run tours where I'd have to pull teeth to get 12 people to show up. They're small group tours. I could probably fill a riverboat now with 150 people easily with the size of my audience that I have for my podcast. So not talking directly about travel, I can sell more travel.
Right. Because you've got
this
people
is something
listening
that
for another reason.
Right. But people, there are some people that have figured this out and they realize that this is maybe it's not the only way, but it certainly is a powerful method because what is marketing ultimately? It's introducing people to something that they aren't aware of, right? Here's my company. Here's my product. Here's my business. Oh, I didn't know about that. I might be a good fit for it. And that's all it is. And the way you do that is getting in front of people who, otherwise would not be able to do that. And you do that by going to these adjacent places where people aren't necessarily there for travel, but maybe open to it.
And that's interesting. It kind of reinforces my thought process with this podcast. Anybody that's listened to more than one episode knows it's generally more about the person. This is not come on, we're going to speak 45 minutes about the Balkans. It's let's connect with the person. Let's have hopefully an interesting conversation about what it's like to grow up and go into tourism, or what things came up along through the course of somebody's life that led them to that. And then, of course, if they own a tour operation in the Balkans, then we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then with the hope that somebody will listen to it, feel a connection with the person that I'm having a conversation with. And then, but at the same time, it's not paid marketing. Nobody's paying me. We're just having a conversation.
Podcasting is qualitatively different. To give you an example, I did a show called This Week in Travel from 2009 to I think we killed it 2022 in the pandemic because we had nothing to talk about. So maybe it's 2022. We did it for like 11, 12 years. The show did okay. I think in a normal month, we would get about 20 to 25,000 downloads of the show. We did a show roughly every week. If you look at those numbers compared to the other things I was doing, my website, my social media, where I had 6-figure followings on all the major platforms, when I would meet one of my followers in person, which happened, pretty frequently, almost always, the first thing they mentioned was the podcast. And the reason was they heard my voice and you could develop a bond with someone that you can't do through social media or through text. And podcasting is so much more powerful. The average amount of time spent when someone visits my website is under a minute, 45 to 55 seconds. So I actually calculated how much more time do people spend on my podcast than they do on my website? And the answer was approximately 10,000. Instead of a 45-second page view, they're spending 12 to 13 minutes listening to my voice, which is, that's how you develop a parasocial relationship with someone and you really develop a following. And so I'm guessing the people that listen to this show are going to be far more apt to, care about what you have to say or want to meet you or be more interested than they would if they were to just read the transcript of this.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree completely. Because there's, if you just look at the breakdown of what percentage of communication comes from the words, and then there's the tonality and body language, which kind of can mix together. We're not getting a lot of body language in a podcast, but your tone can change, and the fact that I'm looking at you and having a conversation with you, I can see your facial expressions, your body language, and I believe that carries over to the audience as well.
And, if you're involved in the tourism industry and you're listening to this, like you have a small tour company or something, starting a podcast is not a bad idea. It costs almost nothing. You can get a good microphone that is plenty good enough for under $100. You can get hosting services that cost next to nothing, less than $20 a month. And you can do your own show. So there's a local microbrewery next to where I live. And I'm friends with the owners. The brewer there is a former astrophysicist from NASA, started a brewery. His wife is a professor of chemistry at a local college. And we started a podcast. And we're about 37 episodes into it. And it talks about the history, the culture, the science, the economics of beer and brewing. And our numbers are not compared to like my main show. They're very tiny, right? I think we're doing maybe 2,000 downloads a month. But just the other day, some guy came in, he drove 3 hours out of his way to visit their brewery because he listens to their podcast. He drives around in an RV a lot, enjoys visiting breweries, found this show, listens to it while he's driving. He's like, I got to go there. He comes up And he comes in the middle of the afternoon when there's not a lot of people there. And he does a sampling of all their beers. He's like, this is the best brewer I've been to. Leaves a fantastic review and everything. And that's just one anecdotal example of the power of a podcast. You don't need great numbers, but what you do need is if somebody's interested in going on a trip and they discover your show and they'll learn about something like, oh, you talked to the chef. I want to go to that place. I didn't know about that place. Or there's this bike ride I can take. That's the power of it. And that's very difficult to do if it's just a page on a website.
Yeah, absolutely. You're not going to get that. Nobody's going to come in all excited to meet you and like experience it because, well, I read a blog post of the, top 5 breweries and wherever. So that's great. And several of the guests that I've interviewed here on the show are either, most of them are tour operators. Several of them are doing their own podcasts, and several others have expressed an interest in doing that. So maybe they're listening right now, and I'm going to take advantage of the fact that we have you here. As you mentioned, it's not terribly expensive. I do this show on the road. I've got my, my Yeti microphone that was, I don't know, $150 or something, and no real sound studio. Obviously, I'm sitting in front of my regular Microsoft laptop using the Riverside platform, which is, I think I pay, I don't know, $15 a month or something. And we're generating these episodes. We've done about 90 now. And I also recognize that there's a lot of other people that have decided to do a podcast and they got 3 or 4 episodes in, or maybe only published their pilot episode and didn't go any further. So what would you share as kind of the, what's the thing that typically gets in the way? What's the thing that you always want to caution people? If they come to you and say, Gary, I want to do a podcast, what's the other side of the story other than it's cheap, it's easy, you can do it on your own? But there's another side. A lot of people want to do a podcast and a lot of people want to write a book, but they don't want to write a book. They want to have written a book. Oh, yeah. Okay.
And the reason, so the vast majority of podcasts never make it to episode 7. And the reason is people go like, yeah, I'd like to have a podcast. And they do it. And then something comes up and something has to get put aside. And what gets put aside is the podcast because it was never a priority. It was just a thing that they wanted to do. And then, life gets in the way. And the next thing you know, they just stopped recording it. When I started my podcast, I had no choice. It's not that I quit my job quit me. The pandemic hit. 95% of my income dried up and I was like, I have got to make this work. And I threw myself at it. And, there's a period of about 18 months where I made nothing or next to nothing. And then the show just took off and now it's a very well-paying job for me. But it was the tenacity to stick with it. And I told the people with the beer podcast, I was like, expect about 18 months. That's what you're going to see before until you really start to see traction. Because up until that point, people don't know if the show's going to be around or whatever. And you need time to develop a following and word of mouth. And or like I said, with this guy that visited, and there have been other examples, there are feedback, positive things that we're seeing. Their regulars all listen to the podcast and they're learning things about the beer being brewed and the history and everything else that they didn't know. So there's been tangible benefits, but you have to make it a priority. And if it's not a priority, then it's probably going to fail.
I love that you shared that. And priority can come from a few different things. One can be financial, like my job left me. I need to I got to do something. So that can be a big motivator. And you've got, the skill set in the background probably from my perspective, might seem like a real natural progression with my show. Anybody that's listening is maybe I don't think I've ever discussed this before, but I'm currently, as of this recording, I don't have any sponsors. I haven't really spent a lot of time looking for sponsors for the show per se. I don't have the listenership at this point nobody's sending me a monthly paycheck. And I believe we've had so much success and I've been real tenacious about it because number one, I just wanted to have the conversation. I have a personal desire to just have these conversations, whether it's making money for me or not. And then two, I use it, I connect with people like yourself and other guests that I've interviewed on the show. And, obviously with the hope that some business opportunities will come out of that as a digital marketing person. But that for me is I just really wanted to have the conversations. I had someone recently approach me and say, I think I'd like to do a podcast because I think it's going to be good for my client retention. And I said, okay, but are the conversations you envision having with your guests, are these conversations that you can get excited about? Are these conversations that you believe you can personally get something out of anyway? Because I think that's important. Maybe it's not important for everybody. I don't know.
No, that's true. And this is a case where the journey does have to be as important as the destination. You have to enjoy.
You brought that back around. Yeah.
You have to enjoy the day-to-day grind. For me, I get to research topics I'm interested in and talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something I can, even though, I do have a pretty busy schedule doing the show, it's something I enjoy doing. So it does have to be more than just, obviously you should have some sort of goal in terms of marketing the show.
Mm-hmm.
And I should add, most podcasts will never get to a point where they're going to get sponsors.
Mm-hmm.
Never. Because that's a very high threshold, because a lot of advertisers, they're not looking for shows. It's all just done in bulk. They're looking for numbers, right? Mm-hmm. Budweiser and Coke in these places, they're just tons of money. They're spreading it out. And it costs about in terms of time, it costs as much to deal with a very large podcast as it does a very small podcast. So they're going to deal with the very large one.
Mm-hmm.
And what most ad networks are looking for is like 10,000 downloads an episode, like I said, which is a very high number. But that being said, there are a lot of podcasts below that threshold, oftentimes well below that threshold, that do very well because they're selling their own product or service.
Exactly. Right.
And they can make very good margins on that. Without having to do podcast ads.
Right.
And
I can sit here and say that my podcast is sponsored by Big World Made Small Adventure Travel Marketing.
Yeah,
it is in a sense, so, several of the guests I've had, I've built some websites for them, and that's great. And it's nice to have a financial part of it as well. But at the same time, if someone came to me and said, geez, Jason, you could do a financial investing podcast and make a ton of money and you'd get all kinds of sponsors. Like, yeah, I'd make it 3 episodes before I'm like, okay, I'm out. It's just, so for me, I think I'm definitely a journey type of person. But at the same time, if you don't have a destination, as you were touching on, it's great to have a destination, because a destination will cause you to take that first step and take the journey. So I appreciate that. So I'm curious. So you mentioned one thing I want to touch on. It's not directly related to what we were just discussing, but it's relevant to me because I've been traveling full time. I've been doing the digital nomad thing that's so popular now for the last few years. And one of the things you mentioned was the word burnout. You said you got burnout, you went home, and then you were traveling less, maybe, a few months, 6 months, a year there for a period of time. So anybody that listens to you and says, oh, I was a travel blogger, had the travel website, and I was traveling around the world doing all this stuff, and they can't even imagine, how could you get burnt out on that?
That's because they think you're on vacation.
Yeah.
And you're not on vacation. I was working. I was going at a much harder pace than a lot of people do. I wasn't just getting an apartment somewhere and hanging out for 3 months before moving to the next city. I was traveling, and you do get burned out doing that. And they envision that kind of travel as, like I said, being on vacation, because that's what they think of travel as. I'm leaving home for a limited period of time, and then I get to come back. One of the first things that hit me when I started traveling full time is that I sold my home, and I had a moment of this where I was like in Hawaii, and I was like, I can't go back. There is nowhere to go back to. This is my reality. And it was a huge mindset shift where I had to accept the fact that where I am right now, that's home. And so, yeah, that can
be difficult. That can be difficult. I remember the first time I kind of had my first breakdown. I think I'd been traveling probably 4 or 5 months, and I thought, man, life is amazing. Life is amazing. And one night I went into the kitchen at this place I'm staying at, shared kitchen with 5 other nomads. And I was ready to make some dinner. And I just broke down in tears. I was like, these are not my pots and pans. This is not my kitchen. I like to cook. I'm a foodie. And I just realized, wow, I really miss my kitchen back home. Well, my kitchen no longer exists back home. It's someone else's kitchen now. And all those pots and pans went to Goodwill or whatever. And it was a real moment for me to recognize, like, I can't just go back to my house, to my place, to the kitchen. And that was pretty profound for me. So I always tell people, it's like, it is a big change. It's hard when people ask you, where do you live? Well,
another weird thing is, so I would say in the last year and a half, I got a new place, moved back. I lived in Minneapolis, right on the same street where the riots took place. I left, moved back to my hometown, and I put a lot of my stuff in storage. And so it was only within the last year that I've taken a lot of this stuff out. And it was very strange because I packed this stuff away in 2007 and it was like I just hit pause. And then, a decade and a half later, I'm now hitting play again and taking out dishes and pots and things like that had just been sitting there for the longest time. And it was kind of a surreal experience. But the other thing is, I went and did this and life went on. All my friends got married, had kids, got promotions, moved for jobs, have other things going on in their life now. And, Gary's done traveling around the world. Well, it's a different world that I'm coming back to.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. It sounds like you kept a lot of your stuff for kind of that. Eventually someday I might want this stuff. Right. So you put it into storage. I went the opposite route. I got rid of everything. I left a cast iron skillet and a Dutch oven at my mom's house, but I told her, I said, this is yours now. It's not mine, but don't give it away or don't sell it because I might want it someday. And I think that as I started my course and I'd gotten rid of everything, it became my identity became, okay, I'm a traveler. I got to be a traveler. I don't have any other choice. This is my identity. And I recognized that had I kept some stuff, maybe had I even kept my apartment for a few months, I might have taken a different path. I might have just traveled for a few months, gone back, traveled for a few months. I don't know. So I guess where I'm going with that is, would you advise, if someone came up to you and said, I want to go start traveling the world, what would your advice be as far as how should they jump right into the deep end with both feet or kind of dip their toes in? What would you advise?
All depends on their circumstances.
Okay. Well, yeah.
Not everybody has the luxury to go sell their stuff and travel. They may have family obligations or a job or whatever. I encourage everyone to at least take 1 3-month long extended trip at some point in their life. But everyone's circumstances are going to be different. So, but I suffered the same thing when I finally decided to get an apartment after traveling nonstop. It was like, well, that was my identity. If I'm not this guy anymore, why would people care or pay attention? It turns out they don't care. That wasn't a big deal.
No, I think you're right. And I think that I've been, like I said, 3 years now. I suspect there's some times that I may have said, you know what, maybe I'm going the wrong direction. Maybe I need to adjust a little bit. But it's like, but my identity, I told everybody I'm going traveling. I told everybody I sold all my stuff. And as you travel, you tell everybody you sold all your stuff. And then it's at some point, I think in my case was like, I can't go back. I can't change it. Cause then it's like putting my tail between my legs and, crawling back home and admitting that I was wrong on some level. So these are just the things that bounce around in my head as I continue my journey.
But just, I went back to the US. It's not like I didn't stay in the country. I even, would stay with my parents for a while, did trips around the US. Mm-hmm. I gave my parents my car, just said, do whatever with it. I sold it to them for $1. Mm-hmm. And when I came back, there was like, well, if you want to use it, whatever. They didn't need a second one. So
I should have done that. That would have been a good idea.
So, I mean, there's lots of things you can do. You don't have to do anything.
Mm-hmm. I love it. Well, I appreciate you touching on that because I think some people that listen to the show are aspiring to maybe travel a little bit more, kind of make it a lifestyle. But I think you're right. I think take a 3-month trip, by yourself and go figure out what it's like to travel by yourself because that can be a big shock. It's a lot different than a 1 or 2 week trip. I worked in the travel business a long time. I've traveled a lot by myself at 3 or 4 weeks at a time. But I think 3 months is probably,
those short, if you're traveling for a week or two, that's vacation or
a work trip. In my case,
I talk to people, it's like, well, how can you afford to do it? And it's because in their mind, when you go on vacation, it's not like you can say to your bank, hey, I'm not going to be using the house for 2 weeks, so I'm not going to pay mortgage on it, or I'm not going to pay rent. That's not how it works. All your other expenses keep going on. And you're going on vacation on top of it, right? It's an additional expense. But when you get rid of everything, then that changes the economics of it completely. And I don't think people have ever really, thought about it. Okay, how much do you spend on life? Your car, your oil changes, your gas and electric, your rent, your mortgage, all this stuff, add it all up. And how much does it cost to get a place in Costa Rica or Bangkok or wherever? Not very much. Because you're not paying for a lot of that extra stuff. Food's a lot cheaper. And
you've
that's
got public transport. You've got all these things.
It's not a vacation. It's your life.
Yeah.
You're just living in a different place.
My son, he's 18 and he's got a lot of his friends. He likes to talk about how his dad, is a world traveler, and his friends like, wow, your dad must be rich. I'm like, well, no, but I'll tell you what, I can live a better quality of life traveling than I can, especially because it's important to me. But, the expenses can be quite a bit different as you already touched on, and you can actually go travel and have a life unless you're trying to maintain the house and the car and all the other things back home. Anyway, I appreciate you sharing that part of the story with me. Gary, we've discussed quite a few things, and I want to be respectful of your time. I'm curious, what did I forget to ask you? What should I have asked you, or what do you want to make sure that our listeners know about you, travel in general, or anything really before we wrap up?
Check out my podcast.
Yep.
Everything, Everywhere, Daily, wherever you're listening to this show.
All right. Yeah, very cool. And that will be in the show notes here on my show. So definitely jump over. I've listened to a few episodes now, and it's something that, it's like basically 15 minutes a day. Right. And it's interesting stuff. So anybody who likes podcasts definitely should check that out. And just really appreciate you coming on the show, and look forward to maybe collaborating on some future projects with you in the future. Thanks, Gary. Appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
I trust you enjoyed listening to the conversation as much as I enjoyed recording it. If you're enjoying the Big World Made Small podcast, please take a moment to tell the algorithm by subscribing and posting a review so that others can benefit as well. I also invite you to take a quick trip over to bigworldmadesmall.com and join our private adventure travel community to receive new episode notifications, special access to our guest experts, and perhaps even some exclusive partner offers that we haven't discussed on the podcast. I'll publish another episode soon. Until then, keep exploring. It's the best way to make a big world feel just a bit smaller.